Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you're watching this. Is that getting old yet? How are you guys? I hope you're doing fantastic. Moving on to 5.3, soil degradation and conservation. This one's kind of a quick one, but it has a lot of information packed into it. So, just be prepared for that, especially when I'm going through my lecture video. And also, your workbook is decently sized for the size of this lecture as well, because it kind of has you do some thought processes in regards to it, and possibly looking up, doing a little research on your own. But really, what we're talking about is the destruction of soil. Why are we losing our soil? What kind of farming practices result in these type of what type of farming practices kind of affect the soil, right? We're losing at an alarming rate. And just to clarify, soil I would definitely consider as a non-renewable resource. We're just using way too much of it, or we're losing too much of it by the amount we recover. Remember, we're losing, roughly annually we gain about a centimeter a year, but we're using or wasting about 100 per year. So kind of keep that in mind, where it's like a 1% refilling rate, right? So obviously we're using much more than we're not using, but losing it because of ill-conceived land use techniques. And we'll kind of talk about those today, okay? So stick with me. I'll try making this as quick as possible, but do follow along in your workbook. And, there is some thought processes in your workbook, and I'll talk on that last, all right? Okay, so the biggest kind of thing to know is, we've kind of discussed this, how, this is kind of a recap, but the actual terminology for it is soil changes through steps called succession. That is really what occurs, right? You have your founding blocks, and through a set of steps, you accumulate soil and or an ecosystem. Fertile soil contains communities of organisms that are a part of the nutrient cycle. Those organisms are absolutely essential to that environment. If we get rid of those organisms, the different type of worms or bacteria or beetles, or there's any numerous thousands upon different organisms that live in the soil. They eat it. They actually are good because they break down waste or decaying material and turn it back into nutrients, and then which goes into the soil, then builds upon it. So that's called succession. All right, and kind of getting into that. Well, I'm like already dry mouth. But we're going to talk about primary succession here. There is, it's interesting how IB kind of mainly talks about primary succession. There is a secondary succession, and I'll briefly state on that. But IB definitely focuses on primary succession, because you have to kind of know how the first steps of a new area forming new soil. So primary succession is usually what we talk about is kind of new land area. I often give the example of, let's pretend a island erupts out of the ocean, right, due to volcanic activity. Step one, it tends to be very bare rock, right? It's a brand new landmass, absolutely pristine, right? But it goes through a few steps to build up soil, then to allow organisms to grow, right? It's just a key part of creating landmass. So first you have this bare rock zone, and then really what happens is you start having mosses and lichens grow, however you want to say it, depending on where you come from, and then they die, they break down. So those are the pioneer, we call them pioneer species, where they kind of attach themselves to the rock, grow, and then when they break down, they leave their decomposing bodies behind, right? So then we have a little bit of soil development, and then grasses and small plants will tend to grow, right? Because they latch onto that little bit of soil. And then the soil slowly thickens, right? Because those then organisms then die and add themselves to it, right? And not only that, but think about when you start having grasses grow, they technically, think of the root system. It finds little cracks, and it starts to break apart that rock. So that mineral, that rock, then slightly those smaller pieces become the soil as well. Then we have a soil thickening, and smaller shrubs tend to grow, and then trees start to grow in the final part, right? You just have this building up sensation, building up processes that occur, right? In your workbook, there is kind of a different type of picture setup, but it kind of represents the same stages. So just know that when you're writing that in your workbook to kind of explain each of them, all right? And really, the main process there is you're having, bigger and bigger organisms that take root because you have more and more soil that forms, so then they can then form, right? And just know, I really would like you to put this in your workbook, where stage 5 is really that kind of final community. It's the old growth kind of forest where you have an ecosystem that has everything working together, right? The animals, the abiotic and the biotic type of properties in it. You have all the different types of trees, and they all are part of this ecosystem. So it's important to understand that that's level 5, and it builds its way up to there. Okay, add that to your workbook. If it's not in there, you're wrong. It's just important. I know I don't explain it too much here, but because IB doesn't really add that, but it is an important part of it. Now, well, let me switch. Let me speak on, just for you guys in your reference. I don't think this is going to pop up, but just in case. Secondary succession. So what's the difference between primary and secondary? Well, primary is this new land, right? That's why I often use the example of a island erupting out of the ocean. But you can also think of maybe a volcano, or areas completely wiped out. I mean, completely, where it's bare rock, right? That's primary. Secondary, on the other hand, is where you might have this beautiful forest, and then something comes and happens, like a hurricane, forest fire, and destroys a lot of the organisms. Not all of them, right? There's still soil there, but destroys all the organisms on top. And then, but there's still that soil, then it can grow. So that's secondary succession. So it still has its initial built-up soil ecosystem. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, kind of moving on into the area of, what practices are causing this destruction of soil? Why are we losing 100, centimeters of soil per year, and then gaining very little? And it's really gets down to land use practices or agricultural processes, due to irrigation, monoculture, using one type of crop for a given land, right? We don't see that. We see it now. Like, you can go out to a rice field and see just rice, right? But that's a human interaction. Natural ecosystems often have these complex, many different types of organisms interacting that creates that soil, right? They need one another to create this beautiful soil. When you have one crop, it just simply takes up the nutrients and then leaves it bare. Okay, so I'll speak on that in a second. But you can obviously look at this map. It shows you kind of the areas that are definitely losing more soil than others due to these practices. And this is great. I just kind of add this to the mix, but these are, absolute great just graphics to kind of see, and broken down by, what type of area is losing soil, and what are the reasons, right? But the biggest ones is kind of considered overgrazing. That is the one that's most argued. Now, there is a TED video which I might have you watch that kind of counteracts this, but it's still the ongoing idea about how these processes. So we don't fully understand why the world is desertifying. Using my terminology. I promise, guys, I know what I'm talking about. I just get my grammar or my vocabulary. I'm sure we all, I always jump over my tongue. But anyway, desertification is occurring due to these processes. So overgrazing, agriculture, deforestation are obviously the big ones. And then to a lesser extent, just fuel wood gathering and industry is smaller, right? And then, the big ones really are, and then I like the second graphic because it kind of shows how different each areas are, right? So North America is a lot is due to deforestation, right? Where then you compare that to the ocean or like the islands, and it tends to be more the overgrazing that's causing it. So kind of interesting how different areas of the world are losing their soil due to these big causes. So So the big ones that cause a lot of desertification are overgrazing, deforestation, unsustainable agriculture. We'll talk about that more in a bit. And irrigation kind of goes along with that. Erosion, which kind of also goes along with that. And then obviously desertification, just adding to more deserts. So just the process of desertification is losing soil, right? So overgrazing, just really represents grazing by livestock at high density, which removes vegetation cover. We can blame cattle, pigs for this type of situation, right? We bring in cattle. You might not have seen this, but often areas you bring in these animals, they pretty much just to get as much profit from that animal, we put them in a given area, they eat everything, and there is nothing left for the other animals. So it pretty much wipes out everything. Even tree saplings, new baby trees that are trying to grow, are eaten. So then you don't have any more trees, right? So you pretty much eliminate everything. This increases in soil erosion by wind and water and can lead to desertification, right? So then the land's bare. So wind and rain is able to pick up these materials. Desert deforestation is pretty self-explanatory, right? You remove the forest. If you remove the forest, well, of course you're going to have, due to the same things, water and wind, you're going to have soil loss in regards to that. Unsustainable agriculture, we'll talk about more of those methods, but to kind of add on to here, but using of chemicals, using of pesticides and herbicides kills the natural organisms that live on that area, and even kills the animals, thus wiping out everything, causing more loss, right? Irrigation, we're adding more waters to given areas to grow our crops. Well, then that water then runs, picks up the soil, and it takes it away out to the ocean, right? And then just erosional processes, right? I think these kind of go hand in hand with all, but you have the wind and water is removed from the upper layers of the soil, which tends to be all that beautiful organic material that is breaking down. It takes that up, picks it up through the wind, throws it in the ocean. Same thing with the rivers, pick it up and take it out to the ocean. And we don't have access to that, right? And then finally, enlargement of deserts. We are extending the sizes of our world's deserts just because more and more areas are getting different types of. I would also throw in processes. Global warming is definitely having a huge impact of this. It's completely changing rain systems. Thus, you're getting more rain or less rain in certain areas. Well, you think more rain, well, maybe that's good, right? Well, more rain means more erosion. Less rain is also bad because then you're getting not enough rain to grow these type of organisms. Well, then it's just death and decay, and then that's slowly picked up by the wind. So the extremes are bad in this regard. Okay. And then kind of ending this out, there's a lot of words here, a lot of type of conversations going on. I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, there I don't know what I'm talking about. But really, I guess what I'm saying is this very long-winded, but it's really talking about commercialization. Commercial farms are definitely having a much higher impact on soil erosion than the subsistence farming that we've discussed in the past, right? The whole idea of commercial industrialized agriculture is to really get as much as you possibly can from a given environment. And often to do that, you often throw, pesticides. You often go to monoculture cropping where you just grow one crop repeatedly over and over, which then degrades the soil over and over again to get as much use out of that soil as you can. And then you just throw fertilizer and on top of it to kind of solve the problem for a little bit, but eventually it leads to a longer term problems with this system, right? I think I kind of stated that quite nicely, right? And then obviously we can talk about genetically modified organisms and other policies where just when you have genetically modified crops, which I'm a supporter of, because I think without it we wouldn't be able to feed the world. However, it gives those crops an unfair advantage, and then they end up taking over and killing the things that are naturally in the environment. So in that regard, they're bad. How do you feed the world, and how do you feed the world and also make sure you're doing these things in a natural way? And we'll actually talk about that in the next lecture. Almost done with this one though, ladies and gentlemen. Reduced soil fertility may result in soil erosion, toxification, salinization, and desertification, right? We have many poor farmers, they encourage erosion, right? Because, and then even thinking about subsistence farming or low, not as commercialized, that even has an effect. Because think about, we talked about slash and burn techniques, right? So think about the Amazon rainforest. You have a poor farmer who comes in, they cut down the forest, grow things, right? It grows, but then they cut it down, they send it to, and then they try growing some more. After a couple of years, they find, well, nothing grows anymore, so then they go to the next land spot, cut that down. And what's happening is due to, especially in the rainforest, this was a quiz question, it'll probably pop up another question, you get so much rain, right, that it leaches all the nutrients through the ground. That's kind of key. And when you keep taking it up through crops, well, it keeps leaching. Nothing is replacing those nutrients back in the ground because it gets washed away very quickly. So they find in 2 to 4 years that's all they can get out of land. So then they go and cut down more forest. Well, then that bare land, nothing grows there because the soil is all messed up, and it goes through this whole primary succession again. So just know that. And then here's kind of a bullet point at the bottom, but cultivation exhausts the soil, overgrazing removes the vegetation cover, deforestation, lack of education and knowledge, right? Just not knowing the proper techniques of why you have to keep moving from area to area, or proper techniques to keep one area pristine, right? And just wars, right? Where we have a lot of issues where people are mass migrating due to wars or global warming now, or unfavorable situations that now are causing these type of things. All right, so that is part one. I'm not going to take over too much time because that's already 17 minutes. Do go in the workbook. There is kind of just to talk about one part where you might want to do a little, there is a mind map section in it, which you have to kind of brainstorm about what are the difference, how do you degrade the soil through chemicals, or what type of biodiversity or biology might affect soil, and how other things might affect the soil, right? So there's that, but there's also that last part where it's kind of going through some terms. Do a little bit of research, right? Look up more extensively what monoculture is and those kind of terms, and to kind of talk about, and then you just match them up with the appropriate number. But review them. They're in your workbook for a reason, because they might pop up in vocabulary, especially when we're talking about these things. Okay. Next unit will next part of this, part two, will kind of go into how do we stop this. So we know all the bad, what is not working for the environment, what type of things will work for the environment or to keep soil, let's say. All right. Enjoy. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.